Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS. I'm very happy to welcome you back to our Monday Learning Series after the brief President's Day break, and we apologize for the delay in getting started. We just had a technical issue, which is now solved. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. Our spring series we've called Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, but this is really kind of a best of JTS sort of series. As returning participants know, we spent the first month of the series focusing on various kinds of Israel-related topics, and today we're turning to sort of a core classic JTS area of scholarship and expertise and inquiry, which is our rare manuscripts. So we're really excited to have the newest member of our faculty, Dr. Yitz teaching us today. He's Assistant Professor of Rabbinic Literatures and Cultures at JTS, and his session is called Jewish History and Education Through the Lens of JTS's Rare Manuscripts. So I, for one, am very excited. If you're feeling inspired by this Monday Learning Series, we would love for you to consider sponsoring a session or co-sponsoring a session. We have 3 sponsorship levels, and all of your donations and especially sponsorship gifts really make it possible for us to continue offering this learning for you. I will turn it over now to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the format for our session, Dr. Landis will pause for questions periodically throughout the session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Landis. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The PowerPoint presentation for today's class was in the email that you received earlier today, and we'll be screen sharing it as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Yitz Landis, Assistant Professor of Rabbinic Literature and Cultures at JTS. Dr. Landis's research focuses on the pre-modern transmission of Jewish knowledge, primarily vis-a-vis the history of rabbinic education and the history of the Jewish book. Additionally, Dr. Landis works on the development of Jewish ritual and liturgy. Dr. Landis's current book project traces the reception and transmission history of the Mishna from its inception in late 2nd century until the publication of Maimonides' commentary to the Mishna in the 12th century. We'll be hearing more about that in the session today with Dr. Landis. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Landis.
All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry, 1 second. Make sure to mute myself. So good to see everyone. Some familiar faces, also many other people who I don't know yet, but I'm very excited to learn with. I'm going to be sharing my screen throughout. And as mentioned, also the slides are available online. So can folks see? Can people see the shared screen? Cool. So, as mentioned, I'm a professor at JTS. I work on the history of the transmission of Jewish knowledge over the course of the long first millennium. So this is a fancy way of saying Jewish education, but also how Jewish ideas spread not just from person to person on the teacher-student basis, but also how they move from one geographic area to another geographic area across time. And I look at the long first millennium, which is really from before the rise of Rabbinic Judaism to kind of see where Rabbinic Judaism comes from in the late Second Temple period, and then going into the Middle Ages, because it's only by doing that, only by looking at the long array of these Jewish ideas and Jewish practices, that we can really get a sense of how Rabbinic Judaism became the main form of Judaism. So it is this ancient form of Judaism, a practice that began or really took shape in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the land of Israel, but eventually it became the form of Judaism that is practiced everywhere. And if it's not practiced everywhere, then the folks who aren't doing it are saying, I am not doing that thing. So trying to kind of map that by mapping the history of the corpus of rabbinic literature, the history of Jewish education, the history of rabbinic education. And that's one main area of research. That's what I primarily work on, what we'll talk about today. And I also work in the history of Jewish liturgy. I published on that. I teach that here at the seminary. And at times also looking at the history of Jewish liturgy helps me understand better the history of Jewish ideas and the spread of Jewish knowledge. And we'll talk about that as well, how using Jewish liturgy can help us map the history of Rabbinic Judaism. And a lot of the ways in which a lot of the primary sources I use for this are Hebrew manuscripts. I have been studying Hebrew manuscripts for well over a decade now. I should say my first encounter with Hebrew manuscripts was here at the when I was a senior in high school here in New York City, and we took a class trip to their book room. Professor Kramer was the librarian at the time already, and that really that's when I was bit by the academic Jewish studies bug. And eventually I pursued a BA and an MA in Talmud, a BA in Talmud and Religion, and a master's in Talmud and Late Antique Studies at the Hebrew University. And I worked with manuscripts all the time, but the way that I worked with manuscripts will seem a bit antiquated right now. This is what I used to do. If folks are familiar with these machines, microfilm readers, this is in the basement of the former building of the National Library of Israel, which housed the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts. And that's what I would do. At least one day a week, oftentimes 2 to 3 days a week, I would go down to this basement, and they had microfilm versions of almost every Hebrew manuscript in the world. And if I was lucky, I can get 2 machines at the same time, and that way I could compare manuscripts. Actually, right here, I'm working on a paper that's based on a manuscript that's located here at JTS. So one way in which my work has changed is that I no longer need to go to Jerusalem to the basement of the National Library to view manuscripts. I could just go downstairs to the library here and look at them. But also, I think this machine itself is something which most people now working in manuscripts do not use at all because they just go online to see images. But for me, a lot of my work really changed when I got to Princeton for my PhD, because at the time, the collection of JTS's Geniza fragments, and we'll talk more about that collection later on, was housed at Princeton, and I was able to just actually go and work with the physical artifacts themselves. And working with the physical artifacts for me totally changed how I view Jewish history, how I view Jewish education, because I was able to actually feel more what it was like to study Jewish texts in the Middle Ages. I felt like I was just that much closer to what it meant to be a reader of rabbinic texts in Middle Ages than it was when I was stuck reading it off of these decades-old machines, or even when I was reading it on a computer screen. So today, I will talk about, first, to give a brief introduction to Hebrew manuscript studies. Then I will give an overview of the manuscript evidence for rabbinic literature, focusing on the Mishnah. As was mentioned earlier, my current project is focusing on the history of the Mishnah, the central work of the rabbinic corpus, trying to map its history, the history of its study, to shed light on the spread of rabbinic Judaism and also the history of Jewish education. So I'll give an introduction to the field in general. I'll focus after that on the Mishnah and rabbinic literature, but this is also could serve as an introduction to future talks, as I'd be happy to also teach on Jewish liturgical manuscripts or Bible manuscripts, because these are all things also which I have been working with here at the seminary and also teaching in our collection. So first of all, what is a manuscript? Literally, it's from the Latin manu and scriptus, so written by hand, essentially a handwritten copy of a text. It's a millennia-old technology with much variety and history. We could think about differences around content. So most simply, different manuscripts have different things in them. You could have a manuscript of the Latin Bible, of the Latin New Testament like we have here, a manuscript of the Hebrew Bible, the Mishnah, a Siddur, anything. The genre also could be different. You could have a work that is written to be copied and then read by many people. You could have a letter. It could be written in different languages. It could be in a different paratext. That's the text that appears around the main text. So we could have different ways in which the text is introduced by a header. We could have comments on the side. Those will all be paratexts. It can be made out of papyrus, out of paper, out of leather, out of vellum, out of different materials. It can be prepared in different ways. Oftentimes, we could learn a lot by how the binding was sewn, for example. That might help us understand who made the book and where. It could be a scroll, a horizontal scroll, a vertical scroll, or a codex, a bound book. It could have been created in a professional workshop, which is oftentimes what happened in the Latin context in Christian Europe. And it also could have been created just by an individual who wanted to make a manuscript for themselves. And then we could talk also about its purpose. Is it something which was, again, meant to be read by other people, or was it something that was much more private for one's individual use? We have here one of the most famous medieval manuscripts. This is the Book of Kells, which is a New Testament manuscript from Ireland or Scotland. But given that manuscript really is a very expansive definition of very expansive kind of category, this is also a manuscript. I wrote this yesterday or earlier this week when I was preparing this lecture. It is a handwritten copy of something. And again, this kind of shows the vitality of this technology, right? We live in an age of, I could have written this on my iPhone, but I still write things on paper. And I'm sure many people here also still write things on paper and still make manuscripts all the time. But what's a Hebrew manuscript? And what's unique about Hebrew manuscripts relative to other manuscripts that were written in Arabic or in Latin in the areas which Jews were living in the Middle Ages? So generally speaking, when we use the term Hebrew manuscripts, we're referring to manuscripts that use Hebrew script. We could think in that case also that this could include Yiddish manuscripts, or it could include Ladino manuscripts, or Judeo-Arabic manuscripts, or Aramaic manuscripts. But these are all using Hebrew script. And that by extension, that likely means that they were written by Hebrew scribes or Jewish scribes. You might also hear sometimes Jewish manuscripts as a way to try and define this corpus of manuscripts created by Jews, because the language isn't always Hebrew. But another way of saying is that it wasn't just prepared by a Jew, it usually uses a Hebrew script. Relative to Christian manuscripts and also to some Arabic non-Jewish manuscripts, oftentimes Jewish manuscripts were created for personal use. So what that means is we're very familiar from Christian Europe, from the context of professional workshops, oftentimes in monasteries, where monks might sit and just copy manuscripts. That is part of their religious practice. It is financed by people who donate to the monastery. The monastery raises its own funds to do that. But we don't really have cases like that amongst Jews. Rather, what we oftentimes see, especially in Christian Europe in the Middle Ages, is that a Jew would write a manuscript for themselves, or perhaps for their friend, or because someone would specifically pay them to do that specific manuscript. But they wouldn't just sit and create manuscripts for the sake of creating them, because who would pay for that to actually happen? And they wouldn't necessarily do it as part of preparing something for the market, because the market itself was so unresponsive, and it's so unclear what the market for a given book would have been. And it takes a lot of capital to first create that initially. That begins to change a bit with the influx of paper, which made it to the Middle East centuries before it made it to Christian Europe. And so already towards the turn of the first millennium, we get to the year 1000 or so, we do see that there are a lot more manuscripts created by Jews in Arabic-speaking lands, where they are writing on paper, and therefore also creating a lot more manuscripts for folks because they think they could sell them, not because someone asked them to specifically write that manuscript. Doesn't get to Europe until a few centuries later, and then once it arrives there and they're no longer writing on leather or on parchment, that also does increase the amount of books that are being prepared, not just for personal use, but also for sale in general. So a key distinction when we talk about Hebrew manuscripts is between complete ones, and these are manuscript books that were more or less, they look now like they did when they were first created 1,000 or several centuries ago. So you could imagine a codex, a bound copy of the Bible that was created in Aleppo, for example, in the Middle Ages, the Aleppo Codex. Actually not a great example because we have lost quite a bit of it, but we have other codices like that. Recently, at Sotheby's here, the Sassoon Codex was sold like that, which is an old bound copy of the Bible. And it is more or less the same bound copy of the Bible that existed 1,000 years ago. But in distinction from that, or opposite from that, is manuscript fragments. And these are single pages or several pages of a manuscript that fell apart at some point in the Middle Ages, right? So it was created in the Middle Ages, and its entire life existed in the Middle Ages. It fell out of use, it started falling apart. And so someone threw it out, and then we recovered it in the Geniza because it was deposited there in a ritual fashion, which is how they are supposed to deposit manuscript fragments, with God's name or with Hebrew letters in general, according to some interpretations. Or perhaps the book was taken by a Jew and bound into a book cover, because the material itself is very good for binding books. Or perhaps a Christian, this is more often the case, confiscated a Hebrew book from a Jew at some point, and then instead of throwing out the parchment, used the parchment as a binding in another book. And in recent years, a lot of these fragments have been discovered in book bindings. We call this the European Geniza, or the Italian Geniza, or the German Geniza, depending on where they are found. And now these fragments are being repatriated to an extent, and we're trying to figure out what are the works that were written on the manuscripts from which they come from. So we have complete and fragments. I'll just offer two helpful introductions to this field in general. One is Benjamin Richler. Benjamin Richler was a bibliographer at the National Library of Israel. He has a lot of important books in Hebrew manuscripts, and this is one that's written really for a general public to introduce them to the entire field. And Colette Sirat, professor in Paris, Hebrew manuscripts in the Middle Ages. It doesn't just talk about this, it's also an introduction to Jewish literature in the Middle Ages in general, but the second half of the book is really an introduction to Hebrew manuscript studies. So I'll offer a few more words of introduction on manuscripts. I mentioned Geniza. I'm sure a lot of people immediately thought of the Cairo Geniza. This is the most famous Jewish Geniza that has been discovered. There are others as well. And even when talking about the Cairo Geniza, it's hard to be exact because it isn't one location. It does seem like most of the fragments that came from this Geniza were actually found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. This is a synagogue that was reconstructed several times over the last millennium, but it originally was built around the year 1000. And manuscript fragments were deposited there over the course of centuries, over the course of almost a millennium, actually. The majority of the fragments that were found there, though, really are from the 11th century to the 13th or 14th centuries. They weren't just discovered in the synagogue, they were also discovered in some sites near the synagogue. Eventually, it seems like a lot of the fragments were taken out of the synagogue and dumped in the cemetery nearby and buried in the cemetery nearby. But over the course of the final decades of the 19th century and into the 20th century, European scholars began buying these fragments, and then eventually also really studying them and publishing them. And this has totally impacted, very much changed the way that we do scholarship of medieval Judaism and also late antique Judaism, because A, there are so many works and letters that we just didn't know of beforehand that were found in the Geniza, but also B, just because even the works that we do know of, we now have different versions of them. We have different ways in which they were written, which teach us a lot about the history of these texts and the history of these books, and also the history of the way that they were written. And I'll talk more about that later. The two largest collections in the world, the Geniza fragments, part of the problem is that there were all kinds of folks going to buy stuff there and taking stuff from the Geniza around the same time. And the history of its discovery has been described recently in this book by Rebecca Jefferson. So not all the fragments are in the same place, and you could have fragments of the same manuscript in St. Petersburg, in New York, in Jerusalem. But the largest collection of these fragments in general is, first of all, in the Cambridge University Library, thanks to Salman Schechter, who we'll talk about soon, who went there after having already spoken to a few Europeans who had visited there and realized that he just has to go and buy whatever is left. And the second largest collection is here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, thanks to the collection of Elkan Nathan Adler, a friend of Salman Schechter, who had visited the Geniza a few years beforehand and purchased quite a bit of them. Later I'll talk about how his fragments got to the seminary. There are other major collections. Oxford has a very important collection. There's very important collections in Russia, but really Cambridge and the Jewish Theological Seminary are, just between these two collections alone, you get to around the vast majority actually, of all the Geniza fragments in the world. So we're speaking about Hebrew manuscripts, but we're also speaking about rabbinic literature, because as I mentioned, I want to end up focusing specifically on how we use Hebrew manuscripts in talking about rabbinic literature. So this is a slide with a bunch of words on it. After that, there'll be fewer words, but I just need to define what rabbinic literature is. I'm sure there are folks here on the Zoom who have studied rabbinic literature, who are familiar with rabbinic literature, maybe even studied a lot of rabbinic literature, but I still think it's helpful for us to define what are we even talking about when we talk about rabbinic literature. So I think most simply, rabbinic literature are the corpus of works, of books, of texts that revolve around the sayings and acts of rabbis who operated in the 1st to 4th century in Palestine, the land of Israel, and 1st to 5th century Babylonia. So this could be anything, right? This could be a book that was written today. I could write a book now that is part of this corpus of rabbinic literature if it tries to adhere to the conventions and refer to the ideas and acts of these rabbis. And as we might be familiar, this is considered to compromise the oral Torah, right? These are supplements to the written Torah. But within that corpus of rabbinic literature, which could encompass everything from the Mishna to the Mishnah Berurah, really 2,000 years of Jewish writing, we talk about classical rabbinic literature as the works that date to the 3rd to 6th century. They were created in the 3rd to 6th century and are chronologically approximate to the rabbis whose opinions are recorded. So classical rabbinic literature, that's the Mishnah, that's the Talmuds, that's Midrash, or early Midrash at least. That is the more classical kind of era. And there is also, within the rabbinic corpus, there is this concept of there being a classical subcorpus, right? If you read Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, he does have a sense of there is a classical era. There are texts that we go back to which have more significance because they are earlier. And this classical corpus can be divided in two axes. There is the chronological one. There are the earlier ones written in the land of Israel in Hebrew that only include the opinions of the Tanaim. And there are the later ones which are written in a mix of Hebrew and Aramaic, which are created both in the land of Israel, and then in Babylonia, we have the Babylonian Talmud. And then we also have an axis of how they are organized. Midrashim are organized as biblical commentaries, while the Mishnah is organized topically, and the Tosefta and the two Talmuds, the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmud, are patterned as supplements or commentaries to the Mishnah. So we have rabbinic literature, we have classical rabbinic literature, and then within classical rabbinic literature, we have this chronological divide between early and late, Tannaitic and Amoraic, and then we have the organizational axis of organized on the Bible or organized topically based off of the Mishnah. That's just by way of making sure we're on the same page because we're going to focus on the Mishnah in a little bit. But still, some more words of introduction on the history of the study of Hebrew manuscripts. I introduced Hebrew manuscripts in general, and now I want to introduce the study of Hebrew manuscripts. And to do that, we have to go back to the beginning of Jewish studies itself, the beginning of academic Jewish studies with what's called Wissenschaft des Judentums. Leopold Zunz, one of the founding figures of this field of study, which has been described by David Sorkin as the key invention of the 19th century that transformed Judaism. It consisted of the application of the new methods of textual study, especially philology and history, to the study of Jewish texts and the history of Judaism. And for these folks, for Zunz, Gans, and Heine, they understood their enterprise to be imperative for the acquisition of equal rights. Judaism had to be emancipated in order for the Jews to be emancipated. So this is very much coming out of a certain political position that the Jews were in Europe in the 19th century, by which studying Jewish texts from an academic standpoint shows that there is a history, there is an important history to Judaism, and therefore also Jews themselves should be taken seriously and should be given equal rights like Christians in Christian Europe. At first, Zunz is unbelievably important scholar. Chancellor Ismar Schorsch has the definitive biography of Leopold Zunz. Zunz is someone who wrote on basically everything in Jewish studies, and it is no joke to say that I still use Zunz's scholarship quite often. And any given week, I probably do have to look up something that Zunz wrote, and his works are translated into modern Hebrew, translated into English even, still to this day, because there is this importance of the actual work that he did at that time. Really a foundational figure for the field. But one of the main critiques, or one of the main issues, not really a critique, it's not so fair to call it a critique. One of the issues with his work is that he largely relied on printed versions of ancient and medieval works. So he had before him a printed copy of the Mishna, a printed copy of the Talmud, a printed copy of the Bible even. But what they soon began to realize was that if they look at the manuscripts from the Middle Ages, they could uncover important versions of these texts that will impact some of the conclusions of scholars like Zunz. And the main person to whom we are grateful to have actually shown that is his student, Moritz Steinschneider, who's considered to be the father of Jewish bibliography. So he studied with Zunz and others. He taught for many years in Berlin, and he trained many important scholars. But the most important thing he did really was that he actually went out across Europe and tried to figure out what is there, what books were printed, and what books are there in manuscript version in all the libraries in Europe, right? So he ended up writing well over 1,000 publications, and a lot of his publications, a lot of his major publications that, again, we still use to this day, are manuscript catalogs. He went to a library in Munich, for example, and said, here are all the Hebrew manuscripts in this library. And now that I know, 100 years later, what manuscripts are in that library that are relevant to my research, I can go and make sure that when I talk about the Talmud or talk about the Mishnah, I am using the manuscript versions that exist in the world and not just the printed versions. So unbelievably important scholar, and we'll get back to him in a moment. And we are still learning from him. It is still someone who, again, in any given week, the scholars of Jewish manuscripts are working on something which he had written about. And I should say also here at JTS, we have his personal library and also his personal archives. So every now and then I'll be down here in the Red Book Room and I'll see someone coming in saying, oh yeah, I'm looking at the Steinschneider archive. Like they are still researching his work because it could teach us a lot, not just about manuscripts, but also about the history of scholarship in the 19th century. He had correspondences with Jewish scholars and non-Jewish scholars, librarians all over Europe and also all over the Middle East. And so we could learn a lot about the history of scholarship by studying his archive here at JTS. He wrote in a very, 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 very small and hard to decipher hand, but if you're German, it's a little bit easier for you. I'm not. So how do we study Hebrew manuscripts? A moment ago, I talked about philology. I mentioned it briefly. We just spoke about cataloging, but the important work of bibliographers to go and figure out what manuscripts are available in which library. And just recently, a very, very important scholar of Hebrew manuscripts, Malachi Beitoreh, passed away in October, actually, who was based in Jerusalem. And what he kind of invented, or he was the first scholar of codicology of the Hebrew manuscript. By codicology, it literally means the study of the creation of the codex book, right? So there are different ways. I'm sure you've seen this before. You could have a softcover book, you could have a hardcover book, and I'm sure also you've had hardcover books of different qualities, right? There's ones that last for a long time, and there's some that the second you open it up, the binding breaks. And what Beitoreh kind of showed in his years of research is that if we do this work properly, if we carefully study how manuscript books were created in the Middle Ages, it could tell us a lot about who created it, where in the world they were living, because oftentimes the manuscript won't say this was written in Italy in the 11th century. It won't say that at all. It just has the text itself. And he says, but if I know a lot about how manuscripts are created, I can tell you where that manuscript is from and when it is from. And this is a field which he really pioneered more or less on his own. Papyrology is the study of works in ephemera written on papyri, relevant to Judaism, but more in antiquity, not really in the Middle Ages because that technology fell out of use. Paleography is the study of handwriting. I should mention Judith Aljowi-Schlanger, professor at Oxford, one of my main teachers in paleography, who writes a lot on the history of the handwriting that is used in different manuscripts. And again, here too, I might have a manuscript of the Mishnah. I don't know when it's from. By using Aljowi-Schlanger's methodology, I could say, based on the handwriting, I know it is from this place and from this time. Philology either refers to the linguistic study of manuscript evidence, trying to get to the history of what the language once was, or to the study of textual versions of written works, right? So we have the Mishnah and printed version. We know that there are inaccuracies that enter the text over the years. So I look at the manuscripts of the Mishnah, which are older, also have inaccuracies. But by comparing all them together, I might be able to go and reconstruct what the early text might be. And that is what philologists oftentimes do. And that's called textual criticism. So they study manuscripts and other versions to reconstruct the history of texts and perhaps also to create what's called a critical edition of the text. So when trying to create the critical edition, you're trying to create a better version of that text than the ones that were printed until now. And then my favorite thing, ecdotics, which is the study of the creation of critical editions. But that's a very esoteric and highly specialized field of comparing, well, how exactly should we even talk about what the critical edition should look like? I'll just say some of the main collections of Hebrew manuscripts. Number one is the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. I think it still is the largest collection. Just now, the National Library of Israel acquired a pretty large collection of Yemenite manuscripts, but we still have, perhaps, I think, numerically more. Other major ones, it's not just a question of how many, it's also a question of what. And so the Bodleian, Cambridge, British Library, Parma, Vatican, all these are really, really important libraries, which again, it's very hard to just do anything in manuscript studies of Hebrew literature without going to these libraries or using manuscripts from these libraries in microfilm version or in digital versions. And so one last slide on that, how did our library become such a central place for Hebrew manuscript studies? Thanks to Alexander Marx. So in 1886, the seminary was founded. It was reorganized in 1901 to 1902 when Solomon Schechter arrives. Around his arrival, Schechter wanted Steinsteiner to come, but he said, I'm not coming, I'm a little old. He died a few years later. And instead, he sent his prize student, Alexander Marx, who served as professor of history and librarian for 50 years. We just marked actually 70th anniversary of his death and 120 years since his arrival at the seminary. He's able to amass the largest collection of medieval Hebrew manuscripts in the history of the world, I should say, largely thanks to his work with a pretty wide array of donors who we worked very closely with. We have his correspondence with the donors and philanthropists who really saw it as very important for JTS, for America, to actually house this important library and this important collection of Hebrew manuscripts. And a lot of the work that he did with him was actually saying, this is a manuscript that I could purchase. Can you please finance this purchase? And the major purchase is really the most important purchase, basically in the history of the study of Hebrew manuscripts, was when he purchased in 1923 the collection of Elkan Nathan Adler. So Adler was the son of a chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, brother of the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, a lawyer who represented Jewish interests, both communal interests and also financial interests of specific important Jews or wealthy Jews throughout the world, in Europe and in the Middle East and the Near East, and also actually in the Americas as well. And he traveled throughout the world. And whenever he was traveling on business, he also managed to purchase some manuscripts until he had the largest collection of manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts in the world. And then until his partner made a bad business decision and he lost all his money and he needed to sell his manuscripts off. And luckily, we were the buyers, thanks to Alexander Marx. So also that, we just marked 100 years of the arrival of the collection here at the seminary. And we are still studying it. As mentioned earlier, a lot of these are Geniza fragments. He went to the Geniza before Schechter did, but there's also a ton of manuscripts from elsewhere. There's manuscripts from Europe, manuscripts from Persia. Actually, he was one of the first Western Jews to really go to Iran and try and purchase manuscripts from there, from Yemen, from all over the place. And it's an unbelievable resource and one that we are very, very, very far from finishing to study. I'm going to pause here to take some questions, and then we'll continue to look more closely at the history of rabbinic literature and the study of rabbinic literature using manuscripts.
Great, thank you. So friends, just a reminder, if you want to ask a question of Dr. Landis, to send it to, to me in the chat. Well, this was a huge amount of really, really helpful framing and context and just sort of core information. And I learned a new word, ecdotics. I have studied that topic, but I never knew that word, so thank you. I did want to pass along a handful of requests for you to speak slightly slower if you
Yeah,
sure we're not
sure.
going to ask you. Okay. Okay, new questions are just coming in, so I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. So maybe we'll start at some sort of larger and stretching back further questions, but someone just asked about the fire, the JTS library fire. So maybe we'll start more recently. If you could comment on, tell people very briefly about it, and the person was asking what its impact was in terms of what you've been speaking about.
Yeah, so there was a fire here in the 60s. At the time, actually, from what we understand, we're still actually kind of assessing some of the damage to an extent. Most of the manuscripts in the rare books were not harmed. There were some manuscripts that came in not long beforehand from a collection called the Benaim collection, largely manuscripts and rare books or rare printed books that came from Morocco and from North Africa. And they arrived a few months before, and then they were still actually in a part of the library that did actually burn quite a bit. Those manuscripts in the books, some of them were damaged. And one thing which is interesting in the question of conservation is that we know that our technologies now are only what they are, and we know that technology around preservation and conservation will get better as time progresses. And there was a decision with a lot of those rare books to actually hold on to them, even though we don't know, we could try and fix them now. This is in the 60s. They could have tried to preserve them, to conserve them, and to repair them. But there was a fear that more damage might be incurred to those manuscripts were they to try and conserve them at that time. And there was a hope that perhaps decades later, that work could be done without harming the manuscripts in the rare books. So actually, that is the case. And now we have a conservationist here who is working on a bunch of those manuscripts and rare books and is able to do a lot of amazing preservation and conservation of books that were damaged in the fire, either from the fire itself or from the water that was used to put out the fire. And in the end of the day, it's not that many manuscripts, it's not that many rare books. Most of the books that were damaged were books that were in the general circulation. They weren't rare and they weren't medieval or early modern even. But the ones that were from that Benaim collection, so they had only recently arrived there and they were located somewhere else in the library and more exposed to the fire and the water, a lot of them are actually now going under conservation, and we're able to actually resuscitate them, which is pretty amazing. And there always is that kind of pull in conservation of rare books and manuscripts. Do we work on it now, or do we try and wait for the technology to get better, lest we accidentally damage the manuscripts of the rare books while we're trying to conserve them?
That is something else that I didn't know. Thank you for sharing that. That was very wise of us back then, the 19th versions of us. All right, so there are a handful of questions that in various ways are getting at kind of the transitions from kind of an era of oral transmission to a manuscript era to a printing era, which obviously those eras overlap very significantly. There were questions about, and I know you're going to be talking about some of this, so if it's preempting, then you can take a pass, but questions about kind of changes in pedagogy given those different periods, changes in Jewish practice that might have been impacted by sort of having and writing something that we didn't have before, and also changes in kind of self-conception of like, who are we, where did we come from? If you want to comment on any and all of those, since we're the people of the book, and these are such profound changes in how our core texts are reaching people.
Sure. So I will address that a bit after this Q&A a bit. I will talk about the move from oral transmission to written transmission. But I will say already now, there always is an interplay between oral transmission and written transmission of text, or at least there usually is. It usually isn't a stark dichotomy between either this or that. And we could say even when rabbinic literature is being transmitted orally, there is a written transmission of the Bible, right? They are familiar with the written Bible. They are familiar with written texts from day-to-day life or from the book itself, the Bible. And so it isn't necessarily one or the other. And the question of what happens when rabbinic literature is put in writing, I will talk about that shortly. So I don't want to get ahead of it too much.
Great. Here's an interesting question. One of many interesting questions, friends. Someone asked, how do you decide that you need to go to a library and see the physical manuscript in front of you as opposed to looking at a digitized copy?
Yeah,
Well,
it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah, sorry. The main difficulty there is, I mean, ideally I would do both for everything. I think one of the first times I saw a manuscript in a library, I said, I'm having a lot of difficulty reading this, but if I go on my computer, I could zoom in more and use filters and be able to read what's written there. But on the other hand, there are things which you see that you just don't see for whatever reason. When you are in person, you see them and you don't see them on the digital version. So it's hard to know. And again, ideally, you'd want to do both. I think in my own research, usually what happens is I will research a manuscript quite a bit first from an image, whether a printed facsimile or a digital copy, before deciding this is important enough that I should try and actually make a visit there. So that is usually because it is, and I'll talk about a manuscript like this in a moment, it is just such an important manuscript for my own work that it warrants getting help with the family for a few days and putting down the research money to actually visiting that library. Because inevitably I will see things that I just don't see in person. With the JTS manuscripts, it's different because I'm here and I'm here every day and I could go basically most days of the week to read the manuscripts. And so there too, I try and do both. I try and first see what exactly my question is, what I'm having difficulty deciphering, and then going in person to see it because it is available here at the library. And the library here, generally speaking, is quite open to letting folks, especially faculty, use the manuscripts that are here. And then lastly, I will say there are manuscripts out there that are not digitized. There are especially fragments that were found in the bindings of books in Europe. A lot of those are still being discovered and they're not being photographed yet. Last time I was in Northern Italy, I was sitting there looking at manuscripts that were not photographed yet, manuscript fragments. And then the librarian says, oh, you're reading Hebrew. Here are some other fragments we discovered yesterday, like what's in these manuscripts. So there is also that thrill of discovery. And that still happens. There's still all things being discovered in the libraries or in the archives themselves.
Great, thank you. So people have asked also about the impact of awareness of variance from one manuscript to another. So I'm sure you're going to get to that. So I will maybe go back to your sources. And I just wanted to add, you know, in light of what you mentioned about access to the rare materials. So just like a little bit of history. After the fire, the new library that was built in the 80s kind of hid the rare book room, which is technically called the special collections, but rare book room is, you know, more exciting. Kind of hid it away on the 5th floor. It was, you to go through several layers to get access. I, as a student here for 5 years, I think went once to the rare book room. And since our 21st Century Campus project, the rare book room has been brought to the 1st floor of JTS. You see it the moment you walk into the library. The library is easy to find, and JTS faculty are being, you know, actively encouraged to bring students. Members of the public have been coming often. So that's a great change. And I know Professor Landis, you're one of the people who's really taking advantage of that. So let's go back to your.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. I will say that there's basically every course I teach here, it could be in any topic. I will try and at least bring my students at one point during the semester to the rare book room to see relevant items. Cool. So the rise of the academic study of rabbinic literature is oftentimes said to have begun not at JTS America, but JTS Breslau, a few decades beforehand in Breslau, now in Poland. The first director was Zachariah Frankel, oftentimes considered to be one of the founding figures of the conservative movement, who published major studies on the Mishna and on the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud. And the idea of this seminary was to really be a model of positive historical Judaism, of a Judaism that studies its own history, using traditional methods, but also incorporating the work of modern scholarship. And as part of that, the early professors are very important academics. Heinrich Greitz, Greitz is one of the most important historians of Judaism. Yaakov Bernays, who's oftentimes not known of really in Jewish circles, but his father was a very important rabbi in Hamburg. His niece married Freud, but in his own right, he was a very important philologist, a very important scholar of actually classical literature and of medieval Jewish philosophy. And he's considered to be one of the founding figures of classical philology. His name usually appears alongside the name Karl Lachmann, who is oftentimes better known as the founding figure in classical philology, but Bernays was coming along the same conclusions at the same time, and he was actually hired by the seminary to teach philology and to teach philosophy. He eventually became a librarian elsewhere, but not before training the second generation of professors of Talmud at the Breslau Seminary, including Israel Levi. So Israel Levi incorporated a lot of the methodology that Bernays had used in studying classical texts in his study of the Talmud. And just as classicists were saying, if you want to read Lucretius or whichever classical author, we have to go to the manuscript evidence, Bernays' students also realized that they must do that as well with rabbinic literature. So even Frankel, who was an academic, who published extremely important academic works on the Mishnah, very rarely, if ever, used manuscripts in studying the Mishnah. And that jump occurred within that generation and a half of students at Breslau. And it really happened because Frankel and other professors there were trying to learn more from what was going on in the field of classical studies. And then you get these early Talmudists who are incorporating manuscript evidence. I'll just say manuscripts had been used at the time, but usually what was happening was they were publishing works that for whatever reason didn't appear. So there were works of the rabbis that were forgotten, basically because they weren't published in the early modern period. And there were scholarly societies like Mekitzei Nir Damim, which set out to publish these books from manuscripts that people didn't know about because for whatever reason, the printers in Venice in the 16th century just didn't publish them. And a lot of the editions of Solomon Buber, Martin's grandfather, are essentially that. They're these works that were rabbinic, but people didn't know about them because they were only in manuscripts and not printed. But the Breslau students, influenced by Bernays and by Israel Levi, published the first critical editions of known rabbinic works. And actually, one of the first people to do that was our very own Solomon Schechter, who passed through the Breslau Seminary briefly, but was very much influenced by Israel Levi. And he published this, Avot Abinatan, which is kind of like commentary on Masechet Avot. And it's considered to be the first critical edition, the first scientific edition of a rabbinic text. And what makes it scientific is he realizes there are two versions of the text, competing versions. He publishes both of them in parallel, which is an unbelievable innovation of the time. He calls it Shtei Nuschaot. And then he has comments on each version where he highlights differences from manuscripts that he saw in libraries in Europe. And this is one of the first times that ever happened. And it's very much because he is part of this tradition of trying to incorporate the methodologies that were then being used by philologists of Greek and Latin texts into the study of rabbinic literature. 1 second, just going to move something over a bit. So the academic study of the Mishnah needs, I think, a bit of introduction. There are traditional approaches which look at the Mishnah for halachic guidance. They look usually at this individual Mishnah as the main object of study, as it might incorporate a halachic idea. Whereas academic approaches use the Mishnah for rabbinic history, to see the sources in the history of the Mishnah when it was created, as legal history, cultural history, including gender issues. They might use literary studies, and they also might take a text-critical approach. That's the same approach that Bernays, Breslau, and Levi and Schechter were using in other parts of rabbinic literature. And when the Mishnah, they try and do the same thing. They try and say, let's look at the manuscripts of the Mishnah to create a critical edition of the Mishnah, to see what the history of the Mishnah's text was like, to uncover the original version of the Mishnah. And the founding figure of this subfield is Epstein, Yaakov Nachum Epstein, who worked in Berlin, trying to create a critical edition, until he was appointed professor of Talmudic philology, which is a term that he invented, actually, Talmudic philology, at the newly founded Hebrew University, and who Professor Saul Lieberman here referred to as the father of the exact Talmudic science. He set out to write an introduction to a critical edition of the Mishnah, but eventually, in 1948, and actually the war was part of why he decided to publish already, he definitely felt like the work might get lost if he doesn't publish it soon. He wrote an introduction to the Mishnaic text. And this was originally supposed to be an introduction to a critical edition, which he realized he wouldn't be able to make on his own. But he thought that first there needs to be an introduction. This is actually made fun of a bit in Joseph Ceder's film Footnote. Unbelievably large work, over 1,300 pages. And the interesting thing for us is it focuses on the history of the text of the Mishnah. Not a history of the Mishnah itself, but a history of what happens to the text over the course of its period, how the text changes and devolves over the course of time. The weird thing about that is we don't know that much about how the text was actually transmitted. Everyone agrees the text was composed by someone named Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. That's what all traditional scholars agreed upon. Academics might have some hesitations about that. But the question is whether he actually wrote it down or not. And it does seem now, scholars do not disagree at all, that the text of the Mishnah was not written when it was first composed. Over time, it was written down, but the question of when and how it was written down is still very unclear. With that, there is no question that the fact that it was originally transmitted orally must influence the idea of also how we might reconstruct the history of the text. And an issue with Epstein is that Epstein here on the right, he has a chapter, Mishna, was the Mishnah written? He decides, yes, the Mishnah in the year 200 was written down by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. His student, Saul Lieberman, in 1950, said, I don't think so. And then Yaakov Zussman, a professor at the Hebrew University in 2005, said there is no way. We know that the Mishnah was not written down originally because if you open up the Talmud, all 1.8 million words of the Talmud, they talk about the Mishnah all the time, but they never say, let's go see what it says written in the Mishnah. They always say, we recite the Mishnah. We think the Mishnah is recited in this way by people who memorized it by heart. And this ends up being a major, major issue in the scholarship of Epstein, because Epstein thought that we can go back and actually uncover the original version of the Mishnah using the manuscripts, whereas scholars now say the manuscripts are a much later tradition. The manuscripts only first existed in the Middle Ages, whereas from the year 200 to the year 800 or 900, there was no actual written copy of the Mishnah. And that very much influences how we actually can do the work of textual criticism. So when was the Mishnah put in writing? We don't really know. We think it was between the 7th and 8th centuries. The earliest manuscript we have is from the 11th century. There are some fragments from the Cairo Geniza which definitely came from earlier. And by chance, we actually have a few lines of the Mishnah in a magic bowl. This is the magical amulet from, we think, 6th century Babylonia, which incorporate the Mishnah. But as a whole, the Mishnah was not written down until the Middle Ages. But even once it was written down, this is what I was mentioning earlier, the Mishnah was still memorized. There still are folks that might have memorized the Mishnah, and there still is also a recitation tradition. The Mishnah on its own in a manuscript is indecipherable. There has to be someone who teaches you some kind of oral component of how to properly recite it, how to properly understand it. And I'll say on top of that also that I think a big component is towards why the Mishnah might have originally been transmitted in orally and not in writing, and also why it continued to be transmitted orally and not in writing, is because it's expensive. A physical copy of a book is an extremely expensive commodity in antiquity and also in the Middle Ages. Whereas if the text is created in a way that it could be memorized, and if it was memorized, yes, it's expensive to pay teachers to teach people, but anyway, you need to pay teachers to teach people. So there actually is also, might I think, be a cost element to a preference for oral transmission versus written transmission, which is oftentimes, I think, underplayed in this scholarship as well. I think actually I will do a little bit more, and then we'll take questions after that. So I want to introduce, well, what is the manuscript evidence? I've been talking about it, and we haven't actually seen it yet. So I want to introduce it first before we take questions again. So Epstein made a typology. He said, we have manuscripts of the Mishnah on their own. We have manuscripts of the Mishnah with the Talmud. We have ones with the commentary of Maimonides, and we also have the Mishnah in liturgical contexts. This was initially pointed out by Epstein, but developed by Yaakov Zussman, and also in English, you could read about it in this book by Robert Brody. So we'll see what that means. The Mishnah alone, Mishnah with Talmud, Mishnah with commentary, Mishnah in liturgical contexts. The earliest manuscript we have of the Mishnah in its entirety is in Parma in northern Italy, and it's from the 11th century. It was created in southern Italy. And this is what it looks like. It just has the text of the Mishnah with no real commentary on the side. Another one of that same family is the Kaufman manuscript in Budapest, probably 12th century, from Europe, from Italy, closer to Rome, we think, just the Mishnah with nothing else. Here at JTS, we have what's called the Finzi Mishnah, which is from North Italy, written in 1361. As I argue in this article of mine, the Finzi Mishnah and the early generations of the Finzi family, we can actually see that it was copied from the Parma manuscript. There's a colophon where the scribe at the end writes, I wrote this manuscript, my name is so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so Finzi. And we have the same family on the Parma manuscript. The Parma manuscript was owned by the Finzi family, and then eventually they made their own version of part of that Mishnah. It's much, much smaller. And it shows also how folks in 14th century Italy still study the Mishnah. Men still study the Mishnah, and they wanted to have shorter copies of it for themselves to carry around with them. This is specifically the order of Moed on holidays, so we can imagine them also using it to study on holidays. So that's all Mishnah alone. This is the most famous example of Mishnah with Talmud, the Munich Codex. The Mishnah is in the middle, surrounded by the text of the Babylonian Talmud, 14th century France. We have here what it oftentimes looks like. This is an example of JTS from Spain from 1290. We have Mishnah, the whole text of the chapter, followed by the Gemara. So it's the Mishnah and the Gemara together. And there are differences between these manuscripts, and that's what's so interesting about it. Generally speaking, there are differences between Mishnah with Talmud and Mishnah with the Mishnah on its own. An example could be Avodah Zarah. We see that the Mishnah on its own in the Kaufman manuscript without the Talmud, it has lines like this line right here. Rebbe and his court permitted oil. This is non-Jewish oil that they say actually can be used by Jews, although the Mishnah might have said originally you can't use it. This line appears in the manuscripts of the Mishnah on its own, whereas it doesn't appear in the manuscripts of the Mishnah with the Talmud. So at times there actually could be differences of content, even differences of halacha between the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud and the Mishnah on its own in manuscripts without the Talmud. Later, in the 12th century, we have manuscripts of Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah. This is a very, very important, very influential Judeo-Arabic commentary that Maimonides wrote when he was a teenager and in his 20s. We have the manuscript that he himself used. This is in the National Library. The other half is in Oxford. Whereas here we have drafts, actually, a draft version of his commentary that's located here, JTS. You can see the writing is, he's a doctor, so the writing is like real scribbles and everything, very hard to decipher. Whereas here he's writing for someone to copy it, so it's actually a little bit clearer. And then lastly, we also have the Mishnah in manuscripts that are sitters. So this is a sitter we have for North Italy from 1471. And we see, like in today's sitter as well, there are selections from the Mishnah. This is the beginning of Brachot. We have from Masechet Peah, different sections of the Mishnah that are inserted in the sitter to ensure that every day a Jew might engage in some Torah study. Interesting about the Jew who this sitter was written for is that they were a woman. You can see that the blessings that one recites every morning are written actually in the feminine, right? Not that I should be, it says that not should I be a non-Jew, but that I should not be a non-Jewish woman. I should be, that thank you, God, for not making me a female enslaved person. Thank you for making me a woman and not for making me a man. And still in this woman's sitter, there are sections of the Mishnah that are supposed to be studied every day as part of prayer. This is true also in the Geniza. In the Cairo Geniza, we have specific liturgical manuscripts that have Mishnah in them. Sometimes it could be a specific Shabbat. One must study a specific tractate, a specific chapter on Shabbat. Or it could be a specific chapter from the Mishnah on a holiday. This on the left here is a copy of Hallel for a sitter for Pesach, where it says at the end, when you finish Hallel, you should recite the Mishnah. You should start writing the Mishnah of Arei Pesachim. So I think we could take a look at one more liturgical manuscript, and then we're going to stop and take a break for questions. This is a very famous manuscript of ours, which is now at the Met, actually, on loan. And you can see that Tractate Avot is incorporated into the Machzor, into this liturgical book. It's a very, very fancy, very, very expensive manuscript. And you can see not only is it depicted here, not only does it appear here as part of a liturgical book, it's also illuminated. And so the beginning of Avot talks about how Moses received the Torah, and it goes through the chain of transmission through the rabbis. And we even have an actual depiction of Moses receiving the Torah and teaching it to the people of Israel. So it's one of the rare cases we actually have of a Mishnah that is illuminated. Of course, it's a special Mishnah, it's a Tractate Avot, but it's also it's featured in a liturgical context. So let's pause here for a few minutes to take some more questions.
Thank you. So not a question for you, but a few people have asked if we can share the list of all the links to all the books that are going to the chat. So we're actually going to hold off on sending you the links now. These are links to books that are referenced in the PowerPoint. So you have a complete bibliography of these in the PowerPoint, which you can access through the email that you received this morning. Someone asked, do we have any concerns about fraud? Like if it says, if it says that here I am, Maimonides, I wrote this. Do we have any reason to think that it might not have been written by him actually?
We actually know Maimonides' handwriting pretty well at this point. A book just came out about it, actually. I could send a link to it by two JTS alumni, Mordechai Akiva and Shama Friedman. Shama Friedman also was a professor here for some time on Maimonides and the Cairo Geniza. And they go through all the fragments and manuscripts we think were actually written by Maimonides in his own hand. So specifically with Maimonides, fraud is not really much of an issue, but there is a debate over some manuscripts whether it really is his hand, because he doesn't always sign his name. So when he doesn't sign his name, we debate whether we know his handwriting well enough or not. In terms of fraud, I think the notion of what fraud is complicated in pre-modern times because there is a very, very big genre of pseudepigrapha, of folks writing things and assigning them to older historical figures to give these works authority. And there are, for example, a lot of works that were discovered in manuscript form that are associated with authors that certainly didn't write them. And at times, philologists do a lot of work to actually show that no, that author was not the person who wrote that. Perhaps the most famous case is the Zohar, right? So that book is oftentimes associated with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in traditional settings, but scholars are very certain that there's absolutely no way. And philologists can show this based on the language itself, which is a much later version of Aramaic, influenced by words that they were using in medieval Spain and the like. So usually when there's fraud, it's something which I'm not sure that fraud is the proper word to use, because I'm not sure that the authors in the Middle Ages considered to be fraud, or authors in antiquity considered to be fraud. It's almost a way in which folks wrote certain genres. There are certain genres the convention is assigning this work to someone who certainly didn't write it, but perhaps could have written it, because in their own belief of the actual author, it is as important as that specific author would have thought it would be. There is another issue, though. At times in the Geniza, we'll have scribes copy manuscripts and also copy the colophon, the part where the prior scribe wrote down their name. And so when that happens, we kind of say, oh, well, that has confused us a few times, but it doesn't happen that often. And usually we are able to kind of find ways to see that it was actually copied from an earlier book and they just copied the colophon, the inscription of the author, without thinking about it too much.
Thank you. So we have some more great questions that I'm hoping to get to at the end, but I also saw how many amazing slides there are still left in your PowerPoint.
Oh, not that many, but yeah, sure. We want to wait. Should I finish up and then we'll?
If you can, zoom in for us on, some of the manuscripts that you selected,
Sure.
that would be great.
Okay. So you saw these. Sorry. I want to look at one further distinction, and this is complicated, but bear with me because I know you can do it. We spoke about how there are manuscripts with the Talmud and manuscripts without the Talmud. And that's based on content. At times, we could see actually that the content differs between the two branches of the manuscripts. But one thing that linguistic scholars have shown is that a lot of the differences between the manuscripts don't impact the content at all. It's just a different idiom. It's just a different way of talking. So for example, someone might say lift and someone might say elevator, and just based on whether they say lift or elevator, you could kind of guess what their origin might be. And the same thing is also true with the Mishna and the language of the version of Hebrew that is used in the manuscripts of the Mishna. And the scholar who is most associated with this is Moshe Bar Asher from the Hebrew University. We show that there actually is a difference between the orthographic text, the actual letters and words that are used in the Babylonian versus the Palestinian. So the version with the Talmud and the version without the Talmud. And that within the Palestinian branch, there still are differences between manuscripts from Italy and manuscripts from the East. So North Africa, ironically, is called the East, or from Yemen and places like that. And yet, all the traditions originate in the land of Israel. So philologists normally, prior to Moshe Bar Asher, or earlier on in the 20th century, would say, if there are differences between two branches, one is probably more original and the other developed out of that one. And if we're looking at the Mishnah, a text written in the land of Israel, we would assume that the manuscripts that are closer to the land of Israel were original, and the Babylonian version might have originated out of that as some kind of divergence from the initial Palestinian version, the initial version that comes from the land of Israel. And Bar Asher and other scholars say, if we look at the manuscripts closely, we see that's actually not the case. So, for example, the Palestinian branch will say Mimenu, but the Babylonian one, the one that has the Babylonian Talmud, would say Heimenu. And both these words mean from him. I took something, Mimenu, from him. And there is this difference, and you would think, well, I assume the Babylonian branch is a later version of the initial one from the land of Israel. The problem is the version from Babylonia is actually found in letters that we have discovered in the Judean desert that are from the 2nd century. So we know that the version that's found in the Mishnah, in the Babylonian version, already existed in the land of Israel in the 2nd century. And the same thing also, someone in the Mishnah in the Palestinian branch would say that Ani babayit, I am in someone's home, or so-and-so is in someone's home, whereas Babylonian branch would say not babayit, but abit, in the house of. And here too, we think, what's the deal? Why are these two different versions? The Babylonian branch must be later. But no, actually, abit is also documented in 2nd century letters of Bar Kokhba. So we see here versions that appear in the Babylonian branch, but the versions that appear in the 2nd century letters of Bar Kokhba are that are different from the Palestinian branch are already featured in the 2nd century in the land of Israel. Other common differences is in the Palestinian branch, you would say shehu oseh, shehu koreh, that he reads, that he does, whereas Babylonian would say shekoreh, sheoseh. It's the same thing, just without using the third person who. Same meaning, different way of phrasing it. Lemalan lamatan versus lemal lamata, up and down, and also other differences. So what happened? What happened? Why are these differences between the Babylonian branch and the branch in the land of Israel? It seems that the Mishnah was brought to rabbinic circles in Babylonia while it continued to be modified in Palestine. And following the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews moved from Judea, from the area around Jerusalem, to the Galilee. And when that happened, the Mishnah was recast in the Hebrew idiom that was being used in Galilee. So essentially what happened is the version of the Mishnah that made its way to Babylonia in some ways predates the version that we see in the manuscripts of the Mishnah on their own. Now, this is a very, very interesting phenomenon to see, because we would have thought, and scholars did think until somewhat recently, that whenever there's a difference between the manuscripts of the Mishnah on its own versus the manuscripts of the Mishnah in the Babylonian Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud version is later and could be disqualified. But it actually seems that the text made its way to Babylonia as it was frozen in this version that was closer to Judean Hebrew from the area surrounding Jerusalem, but that after it moved to Babylonia and the rabbis moved from the vicinity of Judea to Galilee, the text continued to develop, and it was recast in the Galilean dialect, and also a few halachic differences were added in, because halacha also changed a bit. So that's one way in which studying the manuscripts of the Mishnah has totally changed our understanding of how the text of the Mishnah was created, and how the text of the Mishnah was continued to be edited in the land of Israel after it made its way to Babylonia. So this impacts how scholars present the text of the Mishnah. This is a modern critical edition. You have here the Babylonian version and the land of Israel version, and the differences in the manuscripts of each version. Very unpleasant to read. It was in the mid-90s, and we've gotten a bit better at presenting the text now. But it shows you how our conception of how the text came into existence and how it changed over time has been impacted by our studies of manuscripts. And we therefore also realize that we can no longer get, like Epstein thought, to one original version, but at best we can get to two versions that are presented by the manuscript edition. And then in order to do that, in order to create a critical edition, I know folks see this and it looks like a phone book, but I see this and I'm very, very excited. Because what this is in order to figure out what manuscripts there are in the world of the Mishnah, scholars first had to go through all the libraries in the world to see what fragments and what manuscripts exist in all those various libraries. Yaakov Zussman, who I mentioned a few times, did that work. And then he listed all of them. Here you see lists of Geniza fragments of the Mishnah from our collection. ENA is Elka Nathan Adler. Up there it says Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Each fragment has a number. I go to the back of the book and I say, I want to see Tractate Brachot, Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. And he gives me the numbers of those fragments that talk about that Mishnah. And now I know which manuscripts I need in order to create my critical edition. So for Zussman and for scholars before him, this was so that they could then create critical editions. But in my work as someone who studies the history of Jewish education and history of the transmission of Jewish knowledge, I say this is an amazing data set, because now I know how many manuscripts there are in the world of the Mishnah, and how I can now compare it to other corpuses to see how common or how popular was the specific book in the Middle Ages. This is called bibliometry. So using kind of metrical analysis of books. And so I could say there are basically an equal number of fragments of the Mishnah in the Cairo Geniza as there are fragments of the Babylonian Talmud, or as there are of the most popular halachic work in the Middle Ages, Yitzchak Alfasi's epitome, his summary of the Babylonian Talmud. But the thing is that the Mishnah is a significantly shorter text than either the Babylonian Talmud or Alfasi. The Babylonian Talmud I mentioned has around 1.8 million words. The Mishnah has 200,000 words. So if I use Zussman and I see that if I add up all these numbers basically and make a pie chart, the Mishnah is around equal to the Babylonian Talmud and this very popular halachic guide. The Mishnah is extremely popular. The Mishnah is even more popular because it's smaller, but it has the same number of fragments. So essentially what happened was when the philologists were trying to do textual critical work, without even realizing it, they also created work for book historians, for scholars of history, for scholars of Jewish history, to also look at how popular books were in the Middle Ages and what that might teach us about Jewish education. So now we know that the Mishnah was very important for primary education or for even the education of lay people in the Middle Ages as it's represented in the Cairo Geniza. I can go even further and say, what are the most popular tractates? Perhaps not so surprising. The most popular tractate is Tractate Shabbat. We saw already that some of these liturgical manuscripts of the Mishnah have a Tractate Shabbat in them, because we can see now that this is an aspect of popular piety, right? Jews might get to a certain level of rabbinic education, and then they might kind of stop at learning Mishnah on Shabbat. This is not so dissimilar from also what happens in modern times. But using the cataloging information created by Steinschneider and then Zussman, we could also do this analysis to see what tractates were most popular, and see that also in the Middle Ages, there was this form of piety which revolved around studying Tractate Shabbat in synagogue on Shabbat. And then the second most popular is Brachot, the first tractate in the Mishnah, and that also might have continued to be something that folks studied in lay education as adults, or maybe that has to do more with primary education, that using the cataloging data of all the Mishnah manuscripts in the world, or all the ones in the Cairo Geniza, I can say that Shabbat's popular for lay piety, and Brachot's popular for primary education, and maybe also Shabbat might have something to do with primary education. So that's one aspect of one way in which we could use Mishnah manuscripts, which is, I think, surprising to textual critics, because that's not what they set out to do. They set out to catalog Mishnah fragments and Mishnah manuscripts to create critical editions, but the catalog itself can be used also to study how popular certain works were in the Middle Ages, and therefore also to teach us about Jewish education. Another thing that we can do, which is actually very, very different, is to zoom in on a specific manuscript. This is the Parma manuscript, which for me is one of the most important manuscripts of the Mishnah. And textual critics have studied the Parma manuscript for a very long time. And they think that it's important, but not necessarily the most important, because there are mistakes in it. And this is an example of one mistake. You see here that the column is justified, right? Nowadays, if you want to make a justified column so that it starts nice on this side, that's easy because you start writing on the right side. But if you want to make it justified on the left side, you click in the top of Word and you click the justified button, and it does automatically. In the Middle Ages, you didn't have Word, and it was much harder. And so one of the things scribes did is that they write the beginning of the word that appears on the following line at the end of the prior line. So this is from Tractate Bava Metzia. You see it says B'Yeshenim, and it says Be'emet in the following line. So they wrote the letter Bet at the end of the prior line so they could have the line be justified, so that it could appear nicely to the eye at the end of the line. And the following line, the same thing happens. Mipnei shehu mashbicho, right? Because it makes something better. But it says here shehu, which I mentioned is a difference between the Palestinian branch and the Babylonian branch, whereas here it says shemeh. The scribe was going to write shemashbicho, which is the version of Hebrew used in the Babylonian branch of the Mishnah. But then he picked up his eyes from the page, he looked at the manuscript he was copying from and saw that it said shehu mashbicho, which is the Palestinian version. What's happening here is that this is a mistake that textual critics would say, it's a mistake. We don't care about it. We should throw it out. But someone looking at manuscripts from the perspective of Jewish education says, what happened was the scribe was copying from a prior manuscript. Midway through the line, he started writing down the Mishnah by heart because the scribe was educated. He knew the Mishnah by heart. And the Mishnah he knew by heart was the Mishnah according to the Babylonian tradition that said Shemash Bicho. But when he picked up his eyes at the end of the line to see what it said in the manuscript beforehand, he started copying a version of the Mishnah that was actually the Palestinian version, Shehu Mashbicho, not Shemash Bicho. It's a difference of 2 to 3 letters, sorry. But it teaches us that when the manuscript was being written in southern Italy in the 11th century, the scribe who wrote it had been trained, had been taught the Mishnah according to a Babylonian tradition. But at the same time, he's also receiving texts from the land of Israel, and he is bringing them, he's copying them in southern Italy, because southern Italy is at this nexus of combining the Babylonian rabbinic tradition and also the tradition from the land of Israel. And this teaches us quite a bit about how Jewish education took place. It teaches us that educated scribes knew the Mishnah by heart, and that seemingly their teachers, the folks who taught them Mishnah when they were kids, had come more from the Babylonian orbit than from the orbit of the land of Israel. So it's the difference of a few letters, literally 3 letters, but it actually teaches us quite a bit about Jewish education and about the importance of this confluence of these 2 traditions. I spoke about how we have in the 2nd century already this divide between the Babylonian tradition and the Palestinian tradition in Rabbinic Judaism, but we started seeing in the 11th century coming back together. And so manuscripts could teach us quite a bit about the mixing of these Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, the mixing of rabbinic Jews from different regions coming together and forming new communities in regions in Europe. So while scholars have used Hebrew manuscripts to study Jewish history and text for well over a century, there's a lot more work to be done. And also the nature of the work itself has changed. And we see that there's technological changes. We could access manuscripts and analyze them more. We could see things on them that we didn't see beforehand, but also to methodological changes. These are related to one another. And I'll just say that the methodology is different because our questions are different. We set out trying to mass all the manuscripts that we could in order to try and create textual critical editions. But then once we created that data, we realized we could now ask questions that we didn't even think we could ask back in the day. And so the question is also now, when we are doing research, we're collecting data, how can we anticipate questions that we might have down the line? Or maybe we can't. And if we can't anticipate those questions, how do we do research now that could allow scholars in the future to do things that we can't even imagine? And the study of manuscripts rabbinic literature, we see also a major shift is from studying the text, like Epstein, to studying the history of the work in the corpus, right? Epstein wrote a whole book on the history of the text in the Mishna, almost 1,400 pages, whereas now we're trying to use the same evidence that he collected, others collected, to learn more about how the Mishna was studied and what it meant for Jews over the course of its transmission into the Middle Ages. And also JTS is a center for this study because of our mission of doing this kind of work and also because the resources we have here in the library and with our students and staff. So thank you. I'm going to stop the share, actually, before we take questions.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to synthesize a few questions that have come in along with my own, because I get to. So I really learned rabbinic literature with a very strong awareness of the frame that you've just shared with us. Josh called, but the conservative yeshiva was a student of Shama Friedman, who you mentioned, and he taught me how to learn Talmud. And then I came to JTS, and there was, having this whole, having all of these texts independently available to us means that, when the people who taught me are looking, people like you are looking at a page of Talmud, they're not seeing sort of one inextricable, page of words, but rather, there's the text that came from, that was codified around the year 200, and then texts that were codified hundreds of years later, and then commentaries hundreds of years after those, which leads to a completely different reading of the text. I think for me, a deeper appreciation of each layer, because you see what it's adding that's different from the context in which the earlier later layer came to be. But that's not how, my son, for example, is in an Orthodox school, is learning text. I'm issuing these correctives all the time. You have the text of the Torah and then Rashi, 2,000 years later, and it's like there's no difference between them. So I guess, I don't know, I guess my question is sort of, where does that leave us now? Is it something, I know the Orthodox world sort of railed against these approaches 100 years ago, which you hear less about now, but how much does this kind of separate us, our different approaches to learning text? Or do you think that it's been long enough that that kind of an awareness of all that's revelatory about studying manuscripts, has that started to make its way into the more traditional world of Jewish study? That's kind of the general topic I would love to hear you share your thoughts on.
Sure, yeah. So I was trained at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at Princeton University. So those are supposedly secular contexts. Hebrew University, I could say anecdotally, a lot of my professors of Talmud are Orthodox. At least they're Orthoprax. They were going to Orthodox synagogues and the like. And before that, I studied actually in relatively Orthodox yeshivas in Israel for a number of years. And before that, I studied at an Orthodox day school here in New York City. And I mentioned that the day school that I went to brought us on a class trip to the JTS or our book room. And the yeshiva that I ended up going to, that primarily the people who I studied with did have training in academic Talmud. Some of them have PhDs in academic Talmud, and they definitely incorporated it to an extent, but it is more apparent. But I think the world itself of Orthodox Judaism is diverse, and there's different approaches to it, and there's different also, I think, ways in which people might approach, well, what does that mean in terms of practice? Like, will this ever impact our practice per se if we discover that there is an halakha because of some kind of accident of textual transmission? I think there's a lot of diversity around that. And I think also there's a lot of texts out there. There's a lot of rabbinic texts. There's the Mishna, there's medieval texts, and then there's the Bible. And I think there are certain avenues, and if you come to the Red Book Room here on any given day, you likely will see an Orthodox reader in the Red Book Room studying something. But more often than not, they're studying texts which I think are a bit easier to kind of rationalize the manuscript study of these texts, because it's not as loaded of an issue to realize that there is a history to the text. So it's not so common. I mean, there are, of course, Orthodox folks studying Bible manuscripts, but the ultra-Orthodox ones are usually not reading Bible manuscripts. They're reading manuscripts of medieval authors, of Maimonides, of folks who wrote Kabbalah and things like that, where the manuscript tradition is very rich, and it's very apparent that there are differences in the text. And if there is a big difference, it's not such a big deal because it's just a medieval author. It's not a text which has a certain level of divinity or sacredness that it would be problematic if there are significant errors in transmission. So I can't speak to it entirely. I'm not an anthropologist, but I do a lot of anthropology in the various libraries that I go to kind of on the side. And yeah, there's definitely is a lot of that, a lot of diversity, I think, within Orthodox worlds.
That's helpful. So, so when it comes to rabbinic literature, it may not be the dominant way of teaching, but it's less threatening than the world of biblical manuscripts.
Yeah, I mean, I think like someone like Zachariah Frankel also, like when he founded the Breslau Seminary. So Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was, very, very disappointed in him and very angry about it, and really kind of one of the leaders of what was called the Neo-Orthodoxy, very critical of Frankel because of things like this. But I think someone like Frankel nowadays would feel very comfortable in several Orthodox institutions were to be alive today.
Thank you. So someone asked, you shared some examples of, or you talked a little bit about Mishnaic text appearing in liturgical contexts, and someone asked about, we could look at a siddur like that and sort of say like, oh, the Mishnah, here's a Mishnaic text, i.e. its original context is over there in the Mishnah, and it was brought here into kind of a secondary context. And this person was asking, is that distinction something that would have been made at the time? Did they sort of think of this comes from over here and we're putting it into here, or is that not a way that those bringing in those texts would have thought about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, because I think at first, initially, yeah, it might have appeared different to them. It might have been like, this is a different kind of text that we are bringing from elsewhere into the siddur, and there's a reason for that. But I think over time, the way they perceive that text also changes. So let me put that into more historical, concrete terms. What I think happened, and it's hard to prove this, is that it's very important for rabbis in general that Jews throughout the world engage in some Torah study at any given day. And a lot of the history of the development of the siddur are elites like rabbis trying to incorporate Torah study into daily liturgy, right? So they'll bring in the Mishnah in the beginning, they might bring in some things at the end, in order to ensure that Jews partake in some acts of Torah study. The siddur is, Judaism's best-selling book, and what better way to share Jewish ideas than via the siddur. But I think over time, the way those texts are experienced by people and interpreted by people is that it's no longer a study, it becomes part of prayer. And once it becomes part of prayer, there is then a need to bring something else into the siddur to make it feel like Jews are doing Torah study. And that is actually part of how the siddur grows over time. I mean, even something like the Shema, the rabbis talk about as Torah study. But for most people in the world, they don't experience the Shema as Torah study, they experience it as liturgy, as prayer. And so I think that on the level of the siddur itself, the text might originally have been felt or perceived to be Mishnah, but at some point, for a lot of praying people, it becomes this part of liturgy. But I do think also it does impact how people perceive of the Mishnah. the Mishnah is quoted in the Siddur more than any other rabbinic text, and that's not by chance. I think it has to do with some kind of understanding of the Mishnah as being divine in a way that the Talmud isn't divine. And I think part of that is both part of why the Mishnah was incorporated in the Siddur, as opposed to the Talmud, which appears a little bit, but far less so. And it also impacts how people proceed to the Mishnah, because the more that it appears in liturgy, the more divinity is given to the Mishnah, the more ritual efficaciousness, as we would say in religious studies terminology, is assigned to the Mishnah. And that's also why you might have parts of the Mishnah in magical amulets, like I showed, because since the Mishnah appears in liturgy and is understood to be divine, it also, the text of the Mishnah can be used to do magic-like things or mystical-like things. And the place where this comes up the most is actually in early modern Tzfat, in 16th century Safed, 17th century Safed, when you actually start seeing Kabbalistic practices take shape around the recitation of the Mishnah. Rav Yosef Karo, who's the famed author of the Shulchan Aruch, was also a part-time Kabbalist, and he had these Kabbalistic visions, which he got into by studying Mishnah. He would say, I'm going to recite Mishnah in order to try and receive some kind of divine revelation, which is apparently what happened to him. And he records it in a book of his. So I think the Mishnah and the Siddur has a very interesting history, and it speaks both to the history of the Siddur itself and some of the goals in trying to use the Siddur to spread Jewish rabbinic ideas, but also it says a bit about how the placement of the Mishnah in the Siddur speaks of how the Mishnah was understood as a divine text, and also how its use in liturgy gives the Mishnah even more divinity and ritual relevance.
It's so interesting. That's something I hadn't thought about, the idea that the Mishnah is the most quoted or inserted, integrated rabbinic text in the Siddur. So we only have a couple minutes left. Can you maybe give us an example of sort of what you were just talking about that you find particularly compelling?
An example of, sorry, of
how the idea of the text of the Mishnah, being earlier, being sort of more potent and therefore brought into the Siddur.
Yeah, so I think I could try and drop a reference into the chat of an article of mine, which I'm happy to share with folks, which I read about this. But I think a big aspect of also the shifting understanding of what the Mishnah is occurs, and this is again an article, but it's an article-length argument, actually has to do following the rise of Christianity, and it's a response to the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And a major part of the polemics with Christians in Byzantine Palestine, in the land of Israel, following the rise of imperial Christianity, has to do with ownership of the Bible. It has to do with the question of, well, given that we share the Bible, what makes us unique? What is unique about us, and what is our text? And when that happens, the Mishnah, I think, becomes more important. And there are certain midrashic texts which really speak to the Mishnah's importance in a way that the early rabbinic texts didn't. Really, following the rise of Christianity, we start seeing the Mishnah talked about in this scripture-like fashion, which is different than how it was talked about prior to the rise of imperial Christianity. And I think it's because of that polemic with Christians, it's because of that anxiety around sharing the Bible, that the Jews kind of say, okay, we share the Bible, we'll give them that, but we have the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is our own kind of sacred text, which is unique to the Jews. And so I think that is a central dynamic also in how the understanding of the Mishnah changes over time. And I think that's also part of why the Mishnah gets into this Siddur. But if it appears in Birkot HaShachar, just in the blessings in the morning, following the blessings over studying Torah, there are just some quotations from the Mishnah that differ in the different rites, but it's quite universal, at least in the traditional rites, that there would be some citations from the Mishnah there.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we ended with that, because it illustrates how, I think much of what manuscript study reveals is interesting in a very esoteric way to people, but there's a lot that's revealed that has to do with big questions that that the rest of us think about too. So, and this session overall is just, there are so many interesting questions we didn't get to, very specific questions. It's just making me think that we need to offer more sessions based on all of on manuscripts, on the development, the evolution of text. I think so. Thank you so much for teaching for us. I think this is your first time.
Yes. Also, happy to meet everyone and introduce myself.
Hopefully the first of many, and thanks for kind of sending us in this direction. I also want to commend to everyone who is, many of you have been so fascinated by this session, a podcast that we made a couple of years ago called The Evolution of Torah. It's a five episode podcast made by Dr. Morty Schwartz, who also teaches here. Much of what was discussed today is addressed in the first season of that podcast, and we recently just made a second season as well. So if this is the kind of stuff that gets you going, I hope that you will go listen to The Evolution of Torah. You can find it in your podcast feed, but jtsa.edu/podcasts is where you can find all our podcasts. So thank you so much again for teaching us, Dr. Landis, and thanks to everyone for joining and for all of these fascinating questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to more of them, and yes, we will definitely bring him back. Thanks for that. We hope all of you will join us next week too. Dr. Sarit Katan Gribitz, who is a JTS fellow and associate professor of classical Judaism at Fordham University, is teaching a session called A Queen in the Tomb of the Kings, an Ancient Monument and Its Modern Legacy. Also sounds a little esoteric, but she's fascinating and wonderful. So I hope that you'll all join us again next week for different kind of journey into the past than what we had today. Thank you again for teaching us today.
Thank you all.
Take care, everyone.